Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all safe and warm tonight. You find me relaxing with a glass of wine and a poem for you to listen to. This week I've decided to read a serious poem by somebody else, not one of mine. It's one of my all-time favourite poems, although the guy that wrote it is not one of my favourite poets. Might be a bit incongruous, but there we are. And the poem in question is the Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde. And in order to fully appreciate the significance of this poem, I think it's necessary to know a little bit about Oscar Wilde and his lifestyle. So forgive me if you already know about Oscar Wilde and his lifestyle, but if you don't, then here goes. Well, Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, to give him his full title. No prizes for guessing that he was Irish, and he was born in Dublin in 1854. He was the second son of two very successful parents. His father was a somewhat eccentric but very eminent ear and eye surgeon, and his mum, who wrote poetry herself, not very successfully, but under the splendid pen name of Speranza. Anyway, she was a leading Irish nationalist and women's rights campaigner. Let me just put my wine down. Okay, so young Oscar led a very privileged and sheltered, happy, carefree childhood and developed an interest in classics, especially Greek, when he was about 16. He studied Greek at Trinity College in Dublin for 3 years and then won a scholarship to Magdalen College in Oxford in 1874. And whilst there, he gained a reputation as being an eccentric genius before he graduated with top double first-class honours degrees in classics. His ambition was to take the literary world by storm. Good ambition. Claiming that somehow or other I'll be famous. And if not famous, I'll be notorious. Well, in the years that followed, he achieved both of those in full measure. He wrote many successful plays and poems and stories, and he reached the peak of his abilities in the early 1890s. So when he was in his late 30s, early 40s. However, he had a tempestuous and somewhat passionate association with a chap called Lord Alfred Douglas, which led to his undoing, unfortunately. Lord Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, didn't agree with Wilde's friendship with his son and accused Wilde of disgusting conduct. Leave you to imagine what that might be. And anyway, it finally concluded in Wilde being arrested in May 1895, and he was sentenced to 2 years hard labour on 25 counts of gross indecency. Well, he spent the first 5 months of his 2 years hard labour in Pentonville prison in London before being moved to Reading for the rest of his sentence. Now, in those days, hard labour meant exactly that. And for a man of Wilde's privileged and pampered background, it proved to be, well, almost unendurable. In those days, there was no attempt at rehabilitation, and a prison sentence was meant to be a punishment, which in Wilde's case it certainly was. The only contact with the outside world was a glimpse of what Wilde describes as that little tent of blue that prisoners call the sky. Anyway, Wilde wrote this poem shortly after his release in May 1897. He was a broken man, both physically and mentally, and he died 3 years later, in November 1900, in exile in France, where he subsequently was buried. The Ballad of Reading Gaol was inspired by his experience in jail and a hanging he witnessed. It tells the story of a guardsman convicted of murdering his lover, who, awaiting execution by hanging, was watched balefully by the other prisoners during exercise periods in the prison yard, or the prison ring as it was called. Their exercise was just walking round and round and round in a ring. Anyway, as the execution draws near, the prisoners become increasingly disturbed by the thoughts of the doomed man. And at 8 o'clock one morning, the guardsman is hanged in front of the prisoners and is hurriedly buried in an unmarked, lime-filled grave. Well, unlike a lot of Wilde's other poetry, which can be very difficult to understand due to lots of classical references and classical language, the Ballad of Reading Gaol is written in stark and simple and extremely provocative style, and it illustrates the profound effect that prison life had on him. And it's a most moving indictment of capital punishment and the inhumanity of the penal system of the time. And in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, it's one of Wilde's best poems, and certainly one of my all-time favourites. Well, it's a long poem, well over 100 verses, but I've reduced it to 27, and hopefully still capturing the storyline and the state of Wilde's emotions and feelings. So here it is, the Ballad of Reading Gaol. I can just check I've got it all. Seems to be some pages missing, but here they are. Right. He did not wear his scarlet coat, for blood and wine are red, and blood and wine were on his hands when they found him with the dead. The poor dead woman whom he loved, and murdered in her bed. He walked amongst the trial men in a suit of shabby grey. A cricket cap was on his head, and his step seemed light and gay. But I never saw a man who looked so wistfully at the day. I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue which prisoners call the sky, and at every drifting cloud that went with sails of silver by. I walked with other souls in pain within another ring, and was wondering if the man had done a great or little thing, when a voice behind me whispered low, "That fellow's got to swing." Yet each man kills the thing he loves, by each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Some love too little, some too long. Some sell and others buy. Some do the deed with many tears, and some without a sigh. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die. He does not sit with silent men who watch him night and day, who watch him when he tries to weep and when he tries to pray, who watch him lest himself should rob the prison of its prey. He does not feel that sickening thirst that sands one's throat before the hangman with his gardener's gloves comes through the padded door and binds one with 3 leather thongs, that the throat may thirst no more. And I, and all the souls in pain who tramped the other ring, forgot if we ourselves had done a great or little thing, and watched with gaze of dull amaze the man who had to swing. For strange it was to see him pass with a step so light and gay, and strange it was to see him look so wistfully at the day, and strange it was to think that he had such a debt to pay. Like 2 doomed ships that pass in storm, we had crossed each other's way, but we made no sign, we said no word, we had no word to say. For we did not meet in the holy night, but in the shameful day. A prison wall was round us both, 2 outcast men we were. The world had thrust us from its heart, and God from out his care. And the iron gin that waits for sin had caught us in its snare. At night, the empty corridors were full of forms of fear, and up and down the iron town stole feet we could not hear. And through the bars that hide the stars, white faces seemed to peer. The warders with their shoes of felt crept by each padlocked door, and peeped and saw with eyes of awe grey figures on the floor, and wondered why men knelt to pray who never prayed before. The morning wind began to moan, but still the night went on. Through its giant loom the web of gloom crept till each web was spun. And as we prayed, we grew afraid of the justice of the sun. At 6 o'clock we cleaned our cells. At 7 all was still. But the sough and swing of a mighty wing the prison seemed to fill. For the Lord of Death, with icy breath, had entered in to kill. We were as men who through a fen of filthy darkness grope. We did not dare to breathe a prayer or give our anguish scope. Something was dead in each of us, and what was dead was hope. We waited for the stroke of 8. Each tongue was thick with thirst, for the stroke of 8 is a stroke of fate that makes a man accursed, and fate will use a running noose for the best man and the worst. And as one sees most fearful things in the crystal of a dream, we saw the greasy hempen rope hooked to the blackened beam, and heard the prayers the hangman's snare strangled into a scream. And all the woe that moved him so that he gave that bitter cry, and the wild regrets and bloody sweats none knew so well as I. For he who lives more lives than one, more deaths than one must die. They hanged him as a beast is hanged. They did not even toll a requiem that might have brought rest to his startled soul, but hurriedly they took him out and hid him in a hole. I know not whether laws be right or whether laws be wrong. All that we know who lie in jail is that the wall is strong, and that each day is like a year whose days are long. Each narrow cell in which we dwell is a foul and dark latrine, and the fetid breath of living death chokes up each grated screen. And all but lust is turned to dust in humanity's machine. The brackish water that we drink creeps with a loathsome slime, and the bitter bread they weigh in scales is full of chalk and lime. And sleep will not lie down, but walks wild-eyed and cries to time. And thus we rust life's iron chain, degraded and alone. And some men curse, and some men weep, and some men make no moan. But God's eternal laws are kind, and break the heart of stone. In Reading jail by Reading town there is a pit of shame, and in it lies a wretched man eaten by teeth of flame. In a burning, winding sheet he lies, and his grave has got no name. And there, till Christ calls forth the dead, in silence let him lie. No need to waste the foolish tear or heave the windy sigh. The man had killed the thing he loved, and so he had to die. And all men kill the things they love, by all let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Well, to me that is, well, powerful, I think is the best word. And if you enjoyed that, I suggest that you read the whole thing, because I've tried to encapsulate the gist of it, the meaning of it, but read the whole thing, and I think you will have a wonderful experience. Okay. Till next week, stay safe.